everyone. It's really wonderful to see such a large house. And I want to introduce John Law, the co-convener of the Visual Arts Program over here, doing some filming for us. It's really my pleasure, in fact, probably my honor, to welcome Jonathan Jones, the keynote speaker tonight. So hello, Jonathan, in your spotty outfit. We can't miss you. Anyway, it's his second time to give a talk at BRLSI. He generously came last year, and he gave a very insightful talk on Artemisia Gentileschi. I was given the pleasure by Betty Suker to pick out an artist for the Extraordinary Women Symposium in May, and I decided I wanted to choose Artemisia Gentileschi for good reason. She was an extraordinary woman, and you indeed pointed that out to us very succinctly and very vividly. Tonight, you're going to give us your perspective on a subject that you've also studied for many years. I think we've talked about it. A young man from Wales, I believe, who suddenly was fascinated and intrigued by the Renaissance, and you traveled extensively in Italy, and you've studied the subject regularly. And in your new book, which is on the screen, so I brought mine just in case it wasn't, Earthly Delights, you cover the artists as pioneers, as adventurers, almost as geniuses, and as if you've known them personally. So you can see the passion and the dedication that you've prepared this book with. After your talk last year, I spoke to you and I said, thank you so much for coming to Bath. And you said, well, I love Bath, and what I love most about Bath is the enthusiastic audience. Well, I think you're in for the same response tonight. So I think without further ado, please welcome Jonathan Jones.
Thanks so much. Yeah, and thanks. It's lovely to be here. And it's lovely to come to this institution, which in a way is a very Renaissance place, I think. One of the things about the Renaissance was they completely widened the idea of intellectual life. So, you know, you hear about Renaissance humanists, which is a modern word, like Renaissance. Renaissance and humanists both come from the 19th century. But, you know, what they were talking about was a kind of intellectual, you know, it's not, you don't have to be too romantic about the humanists being into the human or whatever, but they did believe in taking scholarship and ideas out into the city and into the public realm for everyone, potentially. And you know, I think that idea then went through to the Enlightenment in 18th century England, and I think it's embodied here. I love the fact that this is a place where we can talk about ideas without it being, you know, a closed academic situation, and it very much reflects what I tried to do in this book. Although I have to say I don't remember that much of the book. It was published 2 years ago. This is the second anniversary tour, because no, I do remember it, but you know, I've written quite a few articles and things since then for my living. But I'm working on another book about the Renaissance, which is slightly different, which I might mention later on. But it's absolutely fantastic to have a season about the Renaissance. I think the Renaissance, I absolutely, you know, I believe passionately that the Renaissance was a great time in history and in culture and obviously in art. And that's not, you know, this book was written in order to, in a way, simply show that, to simply show, well, I studied history at university, and when you study history at university, I mean, obviously I studied it a few years ago in the 1980s, but it's still the case, I think, that when you study history in university, by the way, can everyone hear okay? You can all hear fine, good. When you study history at university, if you do the period that's between the Middle Ages and the modern period, it's called the early modern era, and that goes right through from 1450 to 1750. On some definitions, and the Renaissance within that, well, some historians would say it didn't exist, that it was a 19th century fantasy. So in the 19th century, which is obviously a revolutionary century, the century of the Industrial Revolution, and of the 1848 liberal political revolutions and the nationalist revolutions which led to the formation of Italy as a state. You know, Italy had never been a single state until the 1860s. In that era, historians started to speak of the Renaissance, which they saw in a very simple, bold way as this great emancipation from the Middle Ages. There had been the Christian Middle Ages, which were horrible, you know, superstitious, impoverished, feudal, etc. And then in the 15th and 16th centuries, you have this great secular rebellion and liberation from the Middle Ages, from the Christian world of the Middle Ages and that's the birth of modernity, of the modern world. That's how, you know, the 19th century, how they saw it in the 19th century. The most famous book about the Renaissance is The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy by Jacob Burckhardt, I think I pronounced that okay, who was Swiss, came from Basel. And his book is still well worth reading and is still in print, you know. But it's still also a book that's been picked apart by countless historians for a very long time now. It's published in 1860. So you can imagine what fun PhD students have had over the many, many years in sort of picking every idea he had apart. And so you get to the point where the Renaissance is either something that didn't really happen at all and it's a myth, or it was just a very kind of peripheral cultural phenomenon in the arts, which is interesting but didn't change society at a deep level. I find that baffling, and I kind of always did, even when I was a student, but the more my profession is, you know, I'm an art critic, and so I'm very lucky. I get to visit museums a lot. I've had the chance, you know, over the years to go to many European museums and you know, fascinating places, and I have an absolute sense that something incredibly revolutionary happened in the 15th and 16th centuries, which was much more than a peripheral change. And the inspiration for this book, actually, or the germ of this particular book, came when I was in, I actually went to Venice on a work trip. I call it a work trip. It involves staying in a very posh hotel at the expense of Damien Hirst. Really, honestly, we were put up in a fantastic hotel and had private water taxis to take us across to this exhibition he had in Venice. So I had a couple of days, you know, in Venice looking, and I took time out to go around some of my favourite churches and things. And then actually with my family a week later I went to Bruges, where I'd never been, and I noticed some similarities. Obviously, well, you can't help noticing that both places have canals, but also what the Renaissance might have been when really it wasn't just some artists in Italy, it was something that happened all over Europe. And there are connections between things that were happening in Northern Europe and that were happening in Italy. And the biggest connection was mercantile. It was money. This is, by the way, this is the painting that gives the book its title. This is The Garden of Earthly Delights by Bosch. And so part of the sort of visual fun that I had in doing this book and with the publisher was to mix up, put in things that you might not think of as Renaissance art. You might not think of Bosch as a Renaissance artist at all, but a medieval artist, because, you know, he's quite crazy and full of all kinds of bizarre things. Surely that's not very Renaissance, not what we think of as Renaissance. But everything about about this painting, Garden of Earthly Delights, embodies the Renaissance, including its style, its technique, the fact that it uses perspective. Bosch creates a real physical space, a real landscape space. If he wasn't able to do that, he wouldn't be able to create this amazing, convincing, cavorting crowd in the central scene, or any of the bizarre things that you see in hell either. So the first thing about the Renaissance in art is the ability to paint space, spatial depth. There's been a lot of, that really hadn't been how medieval art worked. And there's been a lot of fascinating stuff recently about the Bayeux Tapestry. You know, the Bayeux Tapestry is going to come to the British Museum next year. So we've, thinking about that. But if you look at the Bayeux Tapestry, it's obviously like a huge comic strip and doesn't really have depth. And that was the medieval way of doing it. They didn't know how to show things in depth. It can look, it can work extremely well, that kind of art. The Bayeux Tapestry is incredible. But in the Renaissance, in the 15th century, this is Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini Wedding, which I started the book with. And this is painted in Bruges in the 15th century. And as you can see, it's an incredibly real, incredibly spatially convincing room. This is somebody's actual room. This is what we feel. Whether or not Van Eyck has tricked us a bit about it, we've no way of telling. But it appears to be a real room in a merchant's house. Arnolfini, it's his house, in Bruges. You can still see houses like this. There are many houses like this that survive in Bruges. I think there are other reasons now why this is the absolute essence of the Renaissance. So you've got that ability to depict the real world, to depict real things in real space and real people in real space. Also, the reason this was painted, the man who commissioned it, who's a member of the Arnolfini family, they're merchants from Lucca in Italy. And this, I think, and this is something I'm sort of putting more into the new book I'm working on, but this was what really connected Venice and Bruges, or Bruges and Florence, was money. It was commerce. In the early Middle Ages, there wasn't much money in Europe, there wasn't much commerce, and there weren't many towns. You did have this very basic rural feudal society with castles and peasants and the church. But then you had towns, and you did have towns and cities growing up. And it took a long time. The towns grew up, the trade developed. And Italy, the reason why we always talk about Italy in the Renaissance, it's nothing mystical. It's because Italy was the most commercial of European countries at that time. Italy was not a country, it was a patchwork of city-states, but many of those city-states, they traded between Europe and the Middle East. The Middle East at that time was more economically advanced. You had Byzantium, you had spice trade that connected further east. So cities like Venice, Pisa, Genoa, and Florence. Florence was a latecomer, but these cities, and Lucca in Tuscany, which is where he was from, so all these cities were able to, Italy was in the perfect position to deal across the Mediterranean, but then to take those goods and sell those goods to the sort of what the Italians called the barbarians north of the Alps, us. And there was Europe hadn't got many luxury goods, and so there was a market for it. Say the Italians were in at the ground level of that. And then the Italians also developed banking, and they had international banks. And so there's international merchants, international banks, and that, I think, that network was the driving factor of the European Renaissance. And it did create a completely new world. They wanted a world, they did not want a world that was just, well, they didn't just want to pray. They didn't just want to think about heaven. They wanted to enjoy earthly delights, and in some cases, earthly riches. And so I should have said, trigger warning, there's going to be a lot of nudes. And this one is one of the strangest. The thing about it is, this is by Van Eyck. This is not Van Eyck's original. The original is lost. It is a copy of a lost work by Jan van Eyck. And what fascinates me is that it's very similar. It's almost the same room. It appears to be a version of the same room or another room in the same house. Or if you think David... Is this sound okay? You can sound... Yeah, great. Sorry, it's just weird to me. If you agree with David Hockney, perhaps this is Jan van Eyck's photographic studio. So I see it as it's a nude version of the Arnolfini portrait. In the Arnolfini portrait, they're fantastically well dressed. It's a cold day in the northern Europe, chilly morning in Bruges. They got their furs on. They're completely covered up. And then here, could almost be the same woman, and she's bathing. And that kind of led me into. I speculate about heresy, about whether there are heretical ideas going on here to do with nudity. But certainly, right at the beginning of the Renaissance, before people, some people would not even say Van Eyck was a Renaissance artist. They'd say he's a Gothic artist, a late medieval artist, but one with an incredible grasp of reality. But as early as this, that fascination with earthly pleasure, earthly delight, the body, the human body, that's right there. And Van Eyck was very famous in Italy. He was very popular in Italy. A lot of his paintings ended up in Italy, in Venice, in Florence, in Naples, including nudes. All the nudes are lost, but he was actually famous for painting nudes. So that was, imagine it like a technology, that the art of perspective, of painting real bodies in real spaces, it was like a new technology. And Van Eyck and Northern artists combined it with another new technology, which is oil painting, so that they're not painting in egg tempera, as previous artists had. They're painting in oils, which is much more lush and much more exquisitely subtle in the way it can create colour and reality. So what do they do with that? They have this great technology. Well, of course, they use it to create nudes. They use it to paint naked, in this case, a naked woman, because, well, that's what they do. Of course, there's more to it than that, but maybe not. I don't know. What's certain is that Jan van Eyck's nudes, and we don't think of the nude as Northern, obviously. The Renaissance nude, we think of it as Italian, Mediterranean. But there's no doubt that Van Eyck's paintings, of naked bodies were very popular, very well known, and imitated. And this is a German 15th century imitation of Van Eyck's nudes, although you can see it already taking on a really consciously provocative quality. This is a bit like Cranach's nudes, which are later. This is before Cranach, but it shows that the Germans, they were really kinky from the beginning of the Renaissance. I mean, they were sort of like, there's a sort of wickedness, and in fact, she's a witch. She's not only naked, she's a witch, and so she is evil. And the man has actually caught her doing a spell, so she's performing a spell of some kind, which might involve a human heart in that chest that she's got. And obviously, the man who's chanced in on her is in trouble, probably. He's going to be turned into a frog or... But the northern nude was, I mean, it grows straight out of Christianity. In some ways, it could be Christian, very Christian, because at the Last Judgment, at the day of the Last Judgment, the dead will all rise up out of their graves, they'll be naked, and will stand naked before Christ to be judged, to be sent to heaven or to hell for all eternity. And that's what this is, a painting of the Last Judgment by Hans Memling, another Bruges artist, a little bit later than Van Eyck. And as you can see, there's a huge amounts of naked people. And this is all justified. This is all in completely good taste. And it's all justified, and it could be in a church. It was in a church because, say, it shows the Last Judgment. It's part of the Christian teaching. And to be unclothed, it's also to do with the truth, the naked truth, the true state of the soul. But something's gone wrong with this Last Judgment, because Memling is clearly enjoying it as a great gathering of naked people. He's really enjoying the naked flesh. In contrast to this Last Judgment is by his teacher, Rogier van der Weyden. And this is one of the greatest Last Judgments that ever done. And this is in Beaune in France. And here you can see that Rogier avoids any hanky-panky. He does that by, they're naked, the people are naked, but they're completely separated from each other. They're coming out of different holes, different graves, and in fact on different panels as well. So it manages to be quite decorous, whereas Memling really kind of mixes up the carnality is taking over, pleasure is taking over, earthly delights are taking over what should be a serious religious scene. And it's even worse than that, because these are real people, basically members of the merchant community in Bruges, which is an international merchant community, and their wives or their women opposed for this. And the man in the scales, the man who's praying in the scales, and as you can see, he's being judged to be good. He's Tommaso Portinari, who was the head of the Medici Bank in Bruges. And he commissioned this painting. Well, he didn't even commission it, he kind of stole it. His superior commissioned it, but he managed to hijack it. And he sent it back to Florence. He put it on a boat for Florence because, he was from Florence. In fact, Tommaso Portinari belonged to the Portinari family, and one of his ancestors was Beatrice Portinari, who is Dante's Beatrice. And the Portinari had once been very powerful bankers, but they were kind of declined, like many, what happened to most of the Florentine banks in the Middle Ages. They'd get very, very big, and then they would almost inevitably lend a large sum of money to the King of England, and the King of England would never pay them back. And this honestly broke a whole series of great Florentine banks, the Bardi, the Portinari. So the Medici Bank were obviously a much more successful bank, and they tended to avoid doing things like that. They don't ever lend to the English, that was their motto. But in fact, he did, though. Portinari destroyed the Bruges branch by lending to Charles the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy. There was the local noble, and of course the same thing happened. He wasn't getting paid back. They had to close the Bruges branch. It was a disaster for the Medici Bank. Anyway, so he's saying, no, I'm a good guy, really. Look, the angel is finding me to be good. And he's in this painting, but so are other members, real people. You can tell that they're real people as well, I think. And that's one thing about about nude. People talk about the nude and the naked. These northern paintings, they're not nude in the sense of what we might mean by the nude. The nude is a sort of an ideal. A nude body is an idealized body or perfect body, a body of, very classical proportions, perhaps. We have it's something more formal than just being naked. Whereas these northern paintings, they are just naked because it's reality that they have an eye for. There's a very raw reality. And what they're not doing is imposing a kind of classical ideal on the human form. But when Portinari sent this painting to Florence, so if you've ever been to the Uffizi Gallery, you haven't seen this because it's not in Florence. It never reached Florence. The ship was actually attacked by pirates or privateers who worked for the Hanseatic League, and it ended up in Danzig, and it's still there today. Gdansk. But if it had reached Florence, this is what it would come up against. And this is definitely a nude, or is it? This is Donatello's David. And this was what was happening in Florence, which is similar and yet different. So in Donatello created this for the Medici family, for Cosimo de' Medici. It stood in the Medici Palace. And David was not only a biblical hero, but in Florence was a republic, so David was seen as a hero of the republic. He fights Goliath. To them, it was very clear, this youth who fights Goliath, he's the republic, and Goliath is tyranny. So David is standing up to tyranny. Obviously, it was complete hypocrisy for the Medici to commission this because they were subverting the Florentine Republic and becoming unofficial rulers of the city, which still regarded itself as a republic. But David, obviously, there's a lot more going on here than religion or politics. There were stories in 15th century Florence that Donatello was gay and that he had affairs with his apprentices. According to one of the stories, his boyfriend, ran away and ran to another city, and Donatello went to see Cosimo de' Medici, and he said he needed his protection and help in order to go and kill this guy, to kill his boyfriend. So this is a Christian society, remember, and not a Christian society as we might be, in any recognizable modern sense, but a complete Christian society, a society that is dominated by the church, by the Western Church, what we call today the Catholic Church, but that was everywhere, every village, every town. Everybody believed the same things, which were, defined by Rome, by the Vatican, and everybody, among the things that they believed was that when we see the pages of the Last Judgment, see people literally believed in hell and in heaven and in purgatory, the place between the two. And so one of the things you could go to hell for was sodomy, which was both a capital crime and a mortal sin. But according to this story, when Donatello talks about very openly about his sex life to Cosimo the Elder, Cosimo says, okay, no problem. He's completely familiar with this, completely relaxed about it. But what he does is he writes a letter telling the prince of this other city, to look after Donatello. He's a bit, he's an artist and he's not really going to kill his boyfriend. And that's what happens. He when the two meet, when Donatello and the young man meet, they embrace, they laugh, they're friends again. Anyway, so quite a strange story, and a story that suggests that people, and a story which I won't go into it, but I believe comes from a source very close to the Medici, and it probably reflects what was said in the Medici family about Donatello, who was one of their favourite artists. So, and anyway, even without that, you can see that this is a highly, it's a disturbingly sexualized work. It's like a Caravaggio painting. And the face of David is actually modelled on classical statues of Antinous, who was the lover of the Emperor Hadrian. But I mean, what you have, the other thing though, is that this is classical. As I say, the face is modelled on statues of Antinous, Donatello, and his friend Brunelleschi, who built the dome on Florence Cathedral. They'd studied antiquity, the kind of the pose, what was called the kind of the elegance of this. This is a nude. It's not just a raw, naked body. Whereas this is an earlier Florentine. This is a representation of Venus. So that Florence, what was different about Florence, made it different from Bruges, was that it was obsessed with the classical world. In Italy, you could see the classical world all around you. If you went to Rome, medieval Rome was just a little village, really, and it was dwarfed by the Colosseum and the Palatine, the ruins, palaces on the Palatine, the Pantheon, which still had a Roman domed temple, and still there today. But these things were wonders, and they were there, and so Italians could see these things. And in Florence, got a particular passion about it, and it was in Florence that they obsessively started to rediscover the lost works of classical literature, Roman literature, and Roman philosophy and thought. They went and found manuscripts that were languishing in dusty corners of monasteries all over Europe, and these would be bought, or in some cases stolen, and spirited back to Florence. And Cosimo de' Medici built a library, the San Marco Library, a public library where people could consult, the ancient manuscripts. And the gods, Venus and Mars and all these classical deities. But again, this is where earthly delights start to be really rationalized, because the Renaissance does begin as a kind of very almost primal desire that's shared in merchant communities in the first place, all over Europe, to see the real world in art, to see reality in art, to see ourselves in art, the portrait. But then the rediscovery of classical antiquity, the philosophy of Plato, the political writings of Cicero, the histories of Tacitus, this gave it a much more conscious, almost manifesto, because for people who grew up in a completely Christian world in which sin was, the basic reality. The basic reality was that life was very short. It was very short, and it didn't get any longer during the Renaissance. People's life, if you made it to 40, you were doing well. If you made it to 50, you were an old man or woman. And so, but the paganism of the ancients, with no concept of sin, none of that Christian stuff. That was a liberation for these people 500 years ago. And because everyone agreed that the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks were virtuous and worthy, then their interest in sexuality and nudity and natural things must be okay. I wanted to say, yes, so this is Venus. This is a very early Florentine depiction of Venus, pre-Renaissance, really. But so she's surrounded by kind of demons, but she is the classical goddess of love, and she's firing rays of power out of her vagina. And that was on a birth tray. Basically, these trays, these things were made for sweetmeats. This was the time when when childbirth was incredibly dangerous. There was no, as I say, life expectancy was extremely short, and one of the most dangerous times for women was childbirth, and there was no medicine to speak of. But what they did do in Florence was to bring sweetmeats, confectionaries, sweet restorative. The idea was that the mother, who's, if she survived, then she would eat these nice, sweet fancies, and they would give her some strength and give her some energy. And they had special trays, and that's what when you see paintings of this shape, when you see these funny shaped paintings in the National Gallery or somewhere, that's what they were. They were actually painted as birth trays, and they were, which means that their first audience were women. So it's not true that Renaissance art was just done for, the male gaze. In fact, these works of art were definitely done for women. And this is a mirror. That's Venus and Mars. So Venus, one of Venus's powers was that she could calm the god Mars by sleeping with him. She exhausted him. They were lovers. Venus and Mars are lovers, and one of the texts, one of the classical texts that the Florentines rediscovered, was On the Nature of Things by Lucretius. And Lucretius was a Roman poet writing sort of the time of Julius Caesar, but he wrote this long poem to explain the Epicurean philosophy of the ancient Greeks and the atomic theory of Democritus, which is incredible. It's incredible he wrote it, but also incredible that they were reading it in 15th century Florence, that they were reading this book, which is actually about proving the existence of atoms. And but the thing that struck them a lot was the prayer at the beginning of the book. There's a prayer to Venus, which is kind of complicated because Lucretius says the gods don't exist. But Venus, he's praying to Venus as a kind of symbol of nature. And he says, "Oh Venus, and you alone." He's writing during the Roman civil war. So he's saying, you could bring peace because you're even able to calm the god Mars, and after being with you, he's too shagged out to fight, or something worse to that effect in Latin. And this is the culmination of Florentine interest, classicism, and reading Lucretius and wanting to paint the nude. There was actually, so Donatello's male nude, funnily enough, Donatello's incredibly provocative, challenging male nude, that was done quite, early on. And it was much harder for them to rationalize, to actually, paint the female nude. That was much more of a difficulty. So Botticelli's Venus is usually called the first female nude of the Renaissance. As I've shown, it's not, because Van Eyck was already doing it. But it is very important. And actually, the thing that happens in the Renaissance, you get lots of paintings by artists such as Titian, and they're all called Venus, reclining Venus, Venus with a mirror, but they're just paintings of, they're not the painting, they're sort of the soft porn of the Renaissance, if you like. I mean, they're clearly meant to be erotic paintings, and they're paintings of courtesans who modelled for Titian. But this painting, this really is Venus. This is not a painting of a woman. It's a painting of a god. And Botticelli is such a strange and fascinating and mystical artist. But he is, and he has read Lucretius. He's read this invocation of Venus, in which Lucretius talks about her being wafted by the zephyrs, which is what the wind gods, and being wafted across the water by the wind gods on her shell. So she's coming on her shell, she's floating over the sea to the Isle of Cyprus. But she's also arriving in Lorenzo de' Medici's Florence. The trees on this side, my side, are laurels. And the woman who's going to put a towel around her, she's got laurels around her, all of which are symbols of Lorenzo de' Medici. And another thing I've noticed, and I was looking at this about 4 weeks ago, and another thing I noticed is the gold, the hair. It's not just blonde, it's literally gold. Her hair is literally gold. Oh, her hair is literally golden. And there's gold, and gold also fringes the trees on this side. So, it's the gold of the Medici and the golden age of Florence. But Botticelli is definitely trying to invoke a god here. It's almost a magical painting. You feel there's something so strange about it. I looked at it so many times. I find it so weirdly compelling. I have looked at it really close as well in the Uffizi Gallery, and quite recently. Everyone takes selfies. There's always a crowd of people taking selfies or camera phone pictures of it. It's like what people do nowadays. It's quite sort of civilized in a way, but I'm there in front of them looking very closely. And I think one of the things I think he's trying to capture like the quality of a kind of mother of pearl jewel, actually. It's almost like Venus is a pearl. But also, he's really positing the idea that the pagan gods are real. Somehow, that they are just as real as Jesus, or more so. And he had a lot of problems with this. This is his. I'm not going to ask how many people have been to Florence to the Uffizi Gallery, but if you have been to Florence to the Uffizi Gallery, you'll know that these two paintings are really big. They're not little paintings. They're not, they're extraordinary. And they are sustained, serious attempts to bring the pagan gods to life. But why? Well, because the pagan gods are nature gods. They're amoral gods. They sleep with each other, they fight each other, they have terrible arguments. They're not good people at all, the gods of Olympus. The whole Trojan War happens because the gods disagree and, with something quite petty. And so the gods they're not superior to us, they're human. The classical gods are human. So then you really do get into this thing, absolutely earthly delights, earthly life, the Renaissance saying that the human is more divine than heaven itself. Well, to quote Bob Marley, if you know what your life is worth, you will look for yours on earth. This seems to be what the Renaissance humanists are saying in a lot more complex language. And really, the title of this painting says it all. It's Primavera, spring. It's had that name since the 16th century, when it was seen by Giorgio Vasari, the author of The Lives of the Artists. And he just said it's spring, it's an allegory of spring with Venus in the middle, and these other gods. There's Mercury on the far left, there are the Graces, and then there's a metamorphosis going on where the blue figure in the woods, he's Zephyrus, the wind god, and he is chasing a nymph called Chloris. But then, as a result of that, she changes, she goes through a metamorphosis. And you know, the great source of mythology that they loved in the Renaissance was Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is a Roman book, ancient Roman book, in which Ovid retells all the ancient Greek myths. So that's how it goes. That we'll talk about the classical myth. The ancient Greeks obviously came before the ancient Romans. It was the ancient Greeks who created the classical ideal in art, in architecture, and who also created these incredible myths, which the Romans then adopted. So the Greek Aphrodite becomes Venus, Ares becomes Mars, Zeus becomes Jupiter. So it's a metamorphosis in which Chloris, after being assaulted in Ovid's story by the wind god, she then flowers come out of her mouth. Botticelli shows a stream of flowers coming out of her mouth, and then they become this fantastic flowery dress that Flora wears. She becomes Flora, the goddess of flowers. So it really is the springtime. It's like, renewal, the renewal of the earth, and that the pagan gods express a delight in nature. They allow the Renaissance to just express a delight in nature, which at its most radical is developed by this guy who's contemporary of Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and they're both at this point in Florence. This was painted in Florence in the mid-1470s, a little bit before Venus, but Botticelli was very much around at the same time. And this is a portrait of Ginevra de' Benci, who was considered a very beautiful young woman, and people wrote poems about her. But Leonardo portrays her, and he's actually influenced by those northern artists. Leonardo brought oil painting to Florence, the northern art of oil painting. It's Leonardo who really brings that to Florence, and who, if the way he paints her eyes, they're kind of glass, perfect, unbelievable depth to her eyes, created in oil paint, and really going into new realms. That's a northern portrait from about the same time by Petrus Christus. And this is a Leonardo angel. This is in the National Gallery. So Leonardo, his sense of beauty is just as sort of ecstatic as Botticelli's, but stranger. And not only that, but he takes this reverence for nature, the idea that nature is divine, that earthly delights are what we should be worshipping, as it were. Leonardo takes that further into actual science. So alongside his painting, he does scientific research. And this is one of his anatomical drawings. This is in the Royal Collection at Windsor. Here he's actually dissecting bodies and drawing what he sees. And no anatomist has ever been able to make that beautiful in the way that he does. This is a Renaissance thing that it's almost hard for us. We just don't have the same reverence for beauty or I don't know, maybe we don't see enough beauty, true beauty. I was in Florence a few weeks ago, and it was a heat wave, and it was difficult with the heat and everything, but the light, it was just the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. and you know that light which fills the sky, and you see it in Renaissance paintings. And you know, there's some sense in Italy, what was going on here? Well, I mean, they were in this absolutely beautiful place in Italy, and everything was gorgeous. Anyway, but Leonardo even brings beauty to anatomical dissections. This is one of his maps. So Leonardo combines art and science, and he's the ultimate artist of earthly delights, in the sense that he really goes beyond just depicting the world from the outside, and he starts analysing nature scientifically, and he had some very radical ideas about it. I'm thinking that I should probably take questions. I think, sorry, just very quickly. I love this idea of, you know, of the Renaissance as different continents, the kind of time of discovery. This is absolutely true. This is from a book by Amerigo Vespucci. Amerigo Vespucci was from Florence, and he went to America in the footsteps of Columbus, soon after Columbus, you know, the next year, and he sailed several times. Columbus, who touched, you know, he made landfall in the Caribbean in 1492, but he didn't know what he'd discovered. He didn't know that he had discovered America. He thought he'd discovered a route to China, because that's what he'd said he was going to do. And he never really admitted that he'd found something else, which is why the West Indies are the West Indies, because he thought, oh, well, it's a way to India, to the Indies. But Vespucci said, no, it's a new world, Novus Mundus, and that's why it's named America after Amerigo Vespucci. But Vespucci depicts, so in this book, the people of the New World, they're naked, and this was what Vespucci wrote. He says that they're naked peoples. And that's going on here in Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, just to tie it up. This is why the Garden of Earthly Delights is so central to this book, that in the Garden of Earthly Delights, Bosch is responding. He's in this little town. He's in a little town in the Netherlands. But he's heard reports, he's read reports, seen prints like the one I just showed you, and he's imagining what the new world might be like, that it might be this realm beyond everything he knows, beyond law, beyond sin, beyond the church, a place of abandon, naked abandon. And at the other end of the continent, Michelangelo creates the perfect Renaissance vision, the vision of the Renaissance. Let's say Renaissance man. Let's just say Renaissance human. That Michelangelo's David is naked and nude, but absolutely not a sex symbol, because he's too big to be one. He towers over us. We don't look at him. He looks at us somehow. It's like, you know, we're in the room with him. He's alive. And this is, sorry. Okay, so I'll stop it on my client with that great image and take questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan, for taking us through the earthly delights of the Renaissance. I mean, one thing is for certain. You now officially hold the world record for the most nudes in a presentation. So that's the number one achievement for today. But I think you'll join me in understanding that providing as much context to each of these pictures brings them to life, right? It's not just a painting isn't just a painting. A painting is actually a piece of history and a piece of human history, which I think is really difficult to bring to life. So thank you very much indeed, Jonathan, for doing that for us tonight. Obviously, there's so many questions I would like to ask, but I think we're going to throw it open to the audience in the room first. We've got roughly just under half an hour. So please make yourself known. You've got John on this side holding a microphone, so he's going to do this side of the room, and David Hall here has kindly agreed to do this side. So please be brief in your questions so we can answer as many as possible.
Perhaps tell them to put their hands up if they want to ask a question.
Shall I ask? Hello, thank you so much. I mean, it's been such a delight, such an earthly delight watching this program. I'm watching your slides. And on one of the slides, the depiction of Venus, I happened to notice that on the right of Venus is a lady wearing Indian textiles. So that actually depicts the commercial nature of the period, you know, what was happening in that time. They were actually bringing, and the one before, the lady on the right, and also the next picture shows the lady in the floral, those are both typical muslin textiles from India, because you have these motifs still there today. Thank you.
That's extremely interesting. Yes, I mean, they say it was a world trade, and clothes, I'm not actually sure, but I know, I mean, I was in the Medici in the 15th century, they definitely had Chinese porcelain in their palace, you know. And I think, but also Florence had its own silk industry that they were able to reproduce Chinese methods, and by this time they were actually manufacturing silk in Florence as well. So they literally imitated. No, that's fascinating. Yeah. I mean, with the dress, the flowery dress, Botticelli literally painted clothes, and it was he had done things like this of painting. He was he painted dresses, like painted on them. So there's something going on there that's quite complex about painting and dressmaking as well.
That's a typical. Questions on this side?
That's fascinating. Yeah.
Hello. Firstly, just say thank you very much for a fantastic talk and for all of your reviews over the year, which have certainly encouraged many an exhibition visit for us. In respect of your talk, I was just wondering what your views are on whether we are still labouring under a bit of a kind of Vasarian jackboot in terms of the privileging of Florentine Renaissance works over others. For example, your slightly, your remark about Titian and his Venuses, which for me are utterly sublime and have a certain realism that perhaps some of these Florentine works don't have in their kind of porcelain, very mannered effects.
Sorry, I'm just going to some Titian. Well, that's Giorgione. This is Venetian. Giorgione, Titian's kind of friend. That's Titian, yeah. That's Michelangelo. And that's Titian. They're using the same pose. Well, there's a dialogue between Florence and Venice. Yeah, I should have said the book, as I say, I wrote the book 2 years ago. And then, and it did okay, and the publisher, had the opportunity, was happy for me to do another. And the book obviously very strongly says what you're saying, that yes, we should not just be going on about Florence, that if anything, the Renaissance begins in Bruges, according to this book. And then there's a dialect between Bruges and Venice, and a different one between Bruges and Florence. It's very much, it's very much an attempt to see it, because we're saying, yes, there are definitely contacts between Renaissance Europe and India, and further afield even to China. There is a global trade, and then there are global voyages to the Americas and beyond the Americas. So it really is a changing world. But one of the things I was conscious of is that we need to look at the way Europe itself was a kind of unknown land. Europe was discovered in the Renaissance, and Europe, and there are these places which are, the art schools, the different art styles of the Renaissance. Every city, every Italian city has a different style, and then German cities have their own style. And traditional art history has always known this. It talks about the schools, the Nuremberg school, the Augsburg school. I mean, so I absolutely, that's what this book was saying, absolutely, that it's not just about Florence and that we privilege certain things in the Renaissance, and by shaking it up and saying, well, look at Hieronymus Bosch, yes, I wanted to sort of get people to look at it anew. So what did I do to follow it up? Well, I'm writing a book about Florence, that's all about Florence and all about the Florentine point of view. Why? Because I wanted to go to Florence. Anyway, but yes, you're right. And I didn't mean to be rude about Titian. I didn't mean it as a criticism to say that Titian is sexy. I meant it as praise. And this is the thing about Titian is that he had a very long life. So he goes from doing quite simple paintings to doing extraordinarily, well, I think you used the word sublime. And this is an example of Titian at his most sublime. So this is one of Ovid's stories. This is Danae, and she basically is being made love to by the god Jupiter in the shape of a shower of gold. So in the ancient myths, Jupiter, the king of the gods, he can take any form he wants, and he's constantly taking on different forms in order to seduce women or pursue women, and also to hide from his wife Juno. So this is a shower of gold, and this is the god Jupiter, and it's actually, he's making love to her in the form of a shower of gold. But it's also a joke because the model the model was a famous courtesan, so the gold is also, she's being paid. And this was painted for a cardinal. I believe it was Cardinal Alessandro Farnese. And there's a letter to him from his agent reporting on the progress of the painting, saying, well, Titian has promised, he's working on it, and it's going to make the Venus of Urbino by Titian look like a nun. So that was how they saw it. This is by a woman. This is by Lavinia Fontana, who was from Genoa, and she's had some exhibitions and things recently, deservedly. But so she did naughty paintings as well. Anyway, so that The other question?
Must hold it right up. Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I was just wondering, was it Kenneth Clark who said that to be naked is to be without clothing, but the nude is the body clothed in art? So are you saying that the Northern Renaissance, they were mostly naked, and the Southern Renaissance were the nudes, the sublime nudes?
Yeah, I mean, well, basically, I think what we describe as the nude, I mean, yeah, Clark did say that, but in a more kind of prosaic sense, basically, I think the nude is a classic. It's what's come. It's when they're emulating classical art. So the nude in classical art in ancient Greece, the nude was the highest form of art. You know, there were still obviously nude sculptures survive from ancient Greece, and the Greeks really didn't like wearing clothes. They thought it was a bit barbaric to wear clothes. They laughed at barbarians for wearing trousers. And when, everyone knows about the Olympics are Greek, but they would do athletics naked. It was part of it. And not only that, but obviously homosexuality was very much part of ancient Greek culture. The love, when in Plato's philosophical dialogues have a lot about love, but love is defined as something that happens between men and between an older man and a kind of young man who he's sort of taking under his wing, but also, sleeping with. And so anyway, that's ancient Greece. What was I talking about? The nude. So out of that, so Greek art, really, classical is a good way to describe ancient Greek art. Talk about the Parthenon, the Elgin marbles, the Parthenon sculptures. That's the birth of classical art. So it's kind of modelled on reality, observed from reality, but also abstracted from reality. And there was a Greek sculptor who actually wrote a book called the Canon, in which he defines the perfect human proportions. He was called Polykleitos, and his ideas were recorded by Vitruvius and came down to the Renaissance that way. But the idea that there are perfect human proportions and that's what a statue should be. And Leonardo's drawing Vitruvian Man, very famous, kind of almost silly, famous drawing. That's his illustration of the canon of Polykleitos, really. So what happens in Italy, is that their observations of the naked body are very much mixed with the classical ideal, and you can see that happening in that Donatello's David, and it's happening in Botticelli, and it's happening here too. Although you might not think it. It looks a lot. Titian looks a lot more. He does look real and raw, but at the same time, it's beautiful. There's there are rules going on about what makes it beautiful, I think. But that went north. The answer to the question is that went north. Albrecht Dürer took it north. Albrecht Dürer, he's a printmaker and goldsmith from Nuremberg, travelled to Venice, saw Renaissance art, was besotted with Renaissance art, and he brought back the idea of the proportionate, beautiful nude, the classical nude. He brought that north, and eventually everyone was doing the classical nudes, and that's But it's, I think,
Sorry, shall I ask just a quick question? You've talked about the representation of the Greek and the Roman myths in art. Where would the painters get access to those myths from? Was that a sort of one of the changes or the driving forces behind this material becoming available?
Yeah, well, I think that's one reason for going on about Florence, is that Florence was at the forefront of rediscovering the writings of the ancient Greeks and Romans. The ancient Roman writings were not that hard to rediscover because Latin was still a living language. Latin, which is the language of ancient Rome, but it was still, it's the language of the medieval church as well. It's only recently the Catholic Church has sort of started to use less Latin, but, the Catholic Church did use Latin, so people knew Latin. But Greek was virtually unknown in medieval Europe. The only Greek philosopher who was well known in medieval Europe was Aristotle, but they got Aristotle from the Arab scholars. It was the Arabs had in the 9th century had translated Aristotle, and he was at the foundation of Arab science, and from there it kind of Aristotle came to Europe through that route, because no one in Europe actually, they had more grasp of Arabic and of Hebrew than they did of Greek. So it was in Florence. It was in Florence that the Greek is rediscovered, and partly because basically refugees came to Italy from Byzantium. Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, which has actually survived until 1450. It was in 1453 that Constantinople, the capital of Byzantium, fell to the Turks. And at that point, a lot of Greek knowledge and Greek learning and Greek manuscripts comes to Italy and Florence. Anyway, so where they got the myths from, they got it from ancient writings. And sometimes, and basically, it can be absolutely stunning when you read a letter by someone like Machiavelli and you realize how much classical learning they had. It's like unbelievable. I bet you could take a professor of classics at Cambridge University today, and they would not know half the things that were common knowledge of Renaissance humanists. They were obsessed with it. They really believed. The point is, they believed in 15th century Italy. They believed that the medieval Christian world was garbage, rubbish. That their own world was decadent, awful, barbaric. They thought that, all the cathedrals, which we regard as incredibly beautiful, they thought were barbarian, hideous barbarian stuff. And they thought that the ancient Greeks and Romans were genuinely better, that they had a better way of life, their brains were, much more geared. And they absolutely believed that by rediscovering, resurrecting, this is why Renaissance is a good word in this sense, because it means rebirth. They really thought that if they could rediscover antiquity, they could rediscover everything, how to live. Anyway, I'm going on a bit, but so in terms of actual texts, at the beginning, in the first kind of classical paintings, which is basically Botticelli's paintings, there's all kinds of things. There's Lucretius's descriptions of Venus, Ovid's Fasti, which is a book about festivals. That's actually a very important source of Primavera. But then the most popular book, though, that every artist ended up reading, Titian, everyone, was Ovid's Metamorphoses, which was written in the reign of the Emperor Augustus. So Ovid is a Roman poet, but it's a synthesis of ancient Greek mythology, but told in a quite kind of. Well, Ovid also wrote a book called The Art of Love. Ovid was quite naughty. He's a naughty writer, and the way he tells the myths is naughty as well. So that's one of the reasons that artists like Titian are so, kind of erotic, because they get it from Ovid. And then it's sanctioned by Ovid. It's sanctioned by antiquity for them to paint like this.
Okay, are we running out of questions? There's no questions online. So you've got, yes. I think we're coming to the witching hour pretty soon. We've probably got time for one question.
Yeah.
Yes. Could I ask a question? Central in the Arnolfini marriage is a convex mirror.
Yeah.
Which draws attention to the optics and also, but I imagine, shows the painter.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
Yes, and that's repeated in the next painting that you showed.
Yeah, also. It is, yeah. That's one of the fascinating things. So yes, as you can see at the back of the room, there's a convex mirror, and there are two figures reflected in the convex mirror who are, well, that everyone, I think, rightly thinks that it's actually one of them is Van Eyck. And that if this is some kind of wedding or, a betrothal, Van Eyck himself is a witness to it. And then he's written on the wall above the mirror, Van Eyck was here 1432. So it's, that's why in the book I say it's the first work of art of the Renaissance, because it's actually dated. He was here. But the mirror, Van Eyck is very aware of optics, and this is very much a painting of light. there's wonderful gradations of light. If you look at the chandelier, there are candles lit, but then they're very dull because of the daylight. So it's a very subtle effect where you've got candles, but they're overwhelmed by the daylight from the window, and then that kind of illumines the brass chandelier, and then you have the shadows at the back of the room, obviously very rich shadows, and so on. And Arnolfini's face as well is partly in shadow in a way that's quite strange, actually. I found it, if you look at it up close in the National Gallery, he's quite, he's almost a bit like, I always see it as Death and the Maiden, actually. But that's a sort of, anyway. But all of it is Van Eyck, playing with light. And of course that's the thing about, the North. There were, at the same time in Florence, Brunelleschi, the man who actually was credited with launching perspective in Florence was Brunelleschi, and he did that with an optical game involving mirrors, and where you looked at a picture and then looked at a mirror. It's hard to even understand how it worked, but basically there was optics involved, and the whole theory of perspective is based on optics. It's based on the optical theories of Alhazen, as he was known in Europe, who was one of the medieval Arab scientists. And so, and the funny thing is that, that same mirror is there, and she's using it to see herself, which is weird. I mean, it would be fantastic to actually see the Van Eyck painting. This is just a copy, as I say, so it's much coarser than he would have done it. But
okay, thank you very much, Jonathan. We have got one question, but very short one before we wrap up.
Okay, previous painting, is he dead?
sorry?
Is he dead? In the previous painting you just showed,
Yeah.
he's very much alive and pregnant. But he looks otherworldly.
Yeah, he does, yeah. As I say, yeah, he
Just
looks
wondered,
at...
is he really alive in the painting?
It's incredibly mysterious. No, I agree, yeah. You could almost think that he's a ghost, yeah. It's a horror story.
He's just had a bad day. Look, we've come to the end of tonight, but I mean it's been a real fantastic and privileged experience, Jonathan, for you to not just share Renaissance art with us, and also contextualizing the images that we've seen today, but also to provide a much larger historical perspective on paintings. I will definitely not look at paintings in the same way again. So thank you very much for bringing the Renaissance and the art of the Renaissance to life, and I'm sure everybody will join me in a big round of applause for Jonathan.